Book 9, Chapter 6. Thence, when the time was come, wherein I was to give in my name, we left the country and returned to Milan. It pleased Alypius also to be with me born again in thee, being already clothed with the humility befitting thy sacraments, and a most valiant tamer of the body, so as, with unwonted venture, to wear the frozen ground of Italy with his bare feet. We joined with us the boy Adeodatus, born after the flesh of my sin. Excellently hadst thou made him. He was not quite 15, and in wit surpassed many grave and learned men. I confess unto thee thy gifts, O Lord my God, Creator of all, and abundantly able to reform our deformities. For I had no part in that boy, but the sin. For that we brought him up in thy discipline, it was thou, none else, had inspired us with it. I confess unto thee thy gifts. There is a book of ours entitled The Master. It is a dialogue between him and me. Thou knowest that all there ascribed to the person conversing with me were his ideas in his 16th year. Much besides, and yet more admirable, I found in him. That talent struck awe into me, and who but thou could be the workmaster of such wonders? Soon didst thou take his life from the earth, and I now remember him without anxiety, fearing nothing for his childhood or youth, or his whole self. Him we joined with us, our contemporary in grace, to be brought up in thy discipline, and we were baptized, and anxiety for our past life vanished from us. Nor was I sated in those days with the wondrous sweetness of considering the depth of thy counsels concerning the salvation of mankind. How did I weep in thy hymns and canticles, touched to the quick by the voices of thy sweet-attuned church. The voices flowed into mine ears, and the truth distilled into my heart, whence the affections of my devotion overflowed, and tears ran down, and happy was I therein. Chapter 7. Not long had the Church of Milan begun to use this kind of consolation and exhortation, the brethren zealously joining with harmony of voices and hearts. For it was a year, or not much more, that Justina, mother to the Emperor Valentinian, a child, persecuted thy servant Ambrose, in favour of her heresy, to which she was seduced by the Arians. The devout people kept watch in the church, ready to die with their bishop, thy servant. There my mother, thy handmaid, bearing a chief part of these anxieties and watchings, lived for prayer. We, yet unwarmed by the heat of thy spirit, still were stirred up by the sight of the amazed and disquieted city. Then it was first instituted that after the manner of the Eastern churches, hymns and psalms should be sung, lest the people should wax faint through the tediousness of sorrow. And from that day to this the custom is retained, divers, yea, almost all of thy congregations, throughout other parts of the world, following herein. Then didst thou by a vision discover to thy forenamed bishop, where the bodies of Gervasius and Protasius, the martyrs, lay hid, whom thou hadst in thy secret treasury stored uncorrupted so many years, whence thou mightest seasonably produce them to repress the fury of a woman, but an empress. For when they were discovered and dug up, and with due honour translated to the Ambrosian Basilica, not only they who were vexed with unclean spirits, the devils confessing themselves, were cured, but a certain man, who had for many years been blind, a citizen, and well known to the city, asking and hearing the reason of the people's confused joy, sprang forth, desiring his guide to lead him thither. Led thither, he begged to be allowed to touch with his handkerchief the bier of thy saints, whose death is precious in thy sight. Which when he had done, and put to his eyes, they were forthwith opened. Thence did the fame spread, thence thy praises glowed, shone, thence the mind of that enemy, though not turned to the soundness of believing, was yet turned back from her fury of persecuting. Thanks to thee, O my God. Whence and whither hast thou thus led my remembrance, that I should confess these things also unto thee, which great though they be, I had passed in forgetfulness. And yet then, when the odour of thy ointment was so fragrant, Did we not run after thee? Therefore did I more weep among the singing of thy hymns, formerly sighing after thee, and at length breathing in thee, as far as the breath may enter into this house of grass. Chapter 8. Thou that makest men to dwell of one mind in one house, didst join with us Euodias also, a young man of our own city, who being an officer of the court, was before us converted to thee and baptized, and quitting his secular warfare, girded himself to thine. We were together, about to dwell together in our devout purpose. We sought where we might serve thee most usefully, and were together returning to Africa, whitherward being as far as Ostia, my mother departed this life. Much I omit, as hastening much. Receive my confessions and thanksgivings, O my God, for innumerable things whereof I am silent. But I will not omit whatsoever my soul would bring forth concerning that thy handmaid who brought me forth, both in the flesh, that I might have been born to this temporal light, and in the heart, that I might be born to light eternal. Not her gifts, but thine in her, would I speak of, for neither did she make nor educate herself. Thou createdst her, nor did her father and mother know what a one should come from them. And the scepter of thy Christ, the disciple of thine only Son, in a Christian house, a good member of thy church, educated her in thy fear. Yet for her good discipline she was wont to commend not so much her mother's diligence as that of a certain decrepit maidservant who had carried her father when a child, as little ones used to be carried at the backs of elder girls. For which reason, and for her great age, and excellent conversation, was she, in that Christian family, well respected by its heads. Whence also the charge of her master's daughter was entrusted to her, to which she gave diligent heed, restraining them earnestly, when necessary, with a holy severity, and teaching them with a grave discretion. For except at those hours wherein they were most temperately fed at their parents' table, she would not suffer them, though parched with thirst, to drink even water, preventing an evil custom, and adding to this wholesome advice, Ye drink water now, because ye have not wine in your power, but when you come to be married, and be made mistress of cellars and cupboards, you will scorn water, but the custom of drinking will abide. By this method of instruction, and the authority she had, she refrained the greediness of childhood, and moulded their very thirst into such an excellent moderation, that what they should not, that they would not. And yet, as thy handmaid told me her son, there had crept upon her a love of wine, for when, as the manner was, she, as though a sober maiden, was bidden by her parents to draw wine out of the hogshead, holding the vessel under the opening, before she poured the wine into the flagon, she sipped a little with the tip of her lips. For more her instinctive feelings refused. For this she did, not out of any desire of drink, but out of the exuberance of youth, whereby it boils over in mirthful freaks, which in youthful spirits are wont to be kept under by the gravity of their elders. And thus by adding to that little, daily littles, for who despiseth little things shall fall by little and little, she had fallen into such a habit, as greedily to drink off her little cup brimful almost of wine. Where was then that discreet old woman, and that her earnest countermanding? Would aught avail against a secret disease, if thy healing hand, O Lord, watch not over us? Father, mother, and governors absent, thou present, who createst, who callest, who also by those set over us, workest something towards the salvation of our souls, what didst thou then, O my God? How didst thou cure her? How heal her? Didst thou not out of another soul bring forth a hard and a sharp taunt, like a lancet out of thy secret store, and with one touch remove all that foul stuff? For a maidservant with whom she used to go to the cellar, falling to words, as it happens, with her little mistress, when alone with her, taunted her with this fault, with most bitter insult, calling her a wine-bibber. With which taunt she, stung to the quick, saw the foulness of her fault, and instantly condemned and forsook it. As flattering friends pervert, so reproachful enemies mostly correct. Yet not what by them thou doest, but what themselves purpose, thou dost repay them. For she in her anger sought to vex her young mistress, not to amend her, and did it in private, either for that the time and place of the quarrel so found them, or lest herself also should have anger for discovering it thus late. But thou, Lord, Governor of all heaven and earth, who turnest to thy purpose the deepest currents, and the ruled turbulence of the tide of the times, didst by the very unhealthiness of one soul heal another, lest any, when he observes this, should ascribe it to his own power, even when another, whom he wished to be reformed, is reformed through words of his. Chapter 9. Brought up thus modestly and soberly, and made subject rather by thee to her parents, than by her parents to thee, so soon as she was of marriageable age, being bestowed upon a husband, she served him as her Lord, and did her diligence to win him unto thee, preaching thee unto him by her conversation, and by which thou ornamentest her, making her reverently amiable and admirable unto her husband. And she so endured the wronging of her bed, as never to have any quarrel with her husband thereon. For she looked for thy mercy upon him, that believing in thee he might be made chaste. But besides this, he was fervid, as in his affections, so in anger. But she had learnt not to resist an angry husband, not in deed only, but not even in word. Only when he was smoothed and tranquil, and in a temper to receive it, she would give an account of her actions, if haply he had over hastily taken offence. In a word, while many matrons, who had milder husbands, yet bore even in their faces marks of shame, would in familiar talk blame their husbands' lives, she would blame their tongues, giving them, as in jest, earnest advice, that from the time they heard the marriage writings read to them, they should account them as indentures, whereby they were made servants, and also, remembering their condition, ought not to set themselves up against their lords. And they, knowing what a choleric husband she endured, marvelled that it had never been heard, nor by any token perceived, that Patricius had beaten his wife, or that there had been any domestic difference between them, even for one day, and confidentially asking the reason, she taught them her practice above mentioned. Those wives who observed it found the good, and returned thanks. Those who observed it not, found no relief, and suffered. Her mother-in-law also, at first by whisperings of evil servants incensed against her, she so overcame by observance and persevering endurance and meekness, that she of her own accord discovered to her son the meddling tongues, whereby the domestic peace betwixt her and her daughter-in-law had been disturbed, asking him to correct them. Then, when in compliance with his mother, and for the well-ordering of the family and the harmony of its members, he had with stripes corrected those discovered, at her will who had discovered them, she promised the like reward to any who, to please her, should speak ill of her daughter-in-law to her, and, none now venturing, they lived together with a remarkable sweetness of mutual kindness. This great gift also thou bestowest, O my God, my mercy, upon that good handmaid of thine, in whose womb thou createdst me, that between any disagreeing and discordant parties where she was able, she showed herself such a peacemaker, that hearing on both sides most bitter things, such as swelling and ingested choler used to break out into, when the credulities of enmities are breathed out in sour discourses, to a present friend against an absent enemy, she never would disclose aught of the one unto the other, but what might tend to their reconcilement. A small good this might appear to me, did I not to my grief know numberless people, who through some horrible and wide-spreading contagion of sin, not only disclose to persons mutually angered things said in anger, but add withal things never spoken, whereas to humane humanity it ought to seem a light thing, not to foment or increase ill will by ill words, unless one study withal by good words to quench it. Such was she, thyself, her most inward instructor, teaching her in the school of the heart. Finally her own husband, towards the very end of his earthly life, did she gain unto thee, nor had she to complain of that in him as a believer, which before he was a believer she had borne from him. She was also the servant of thy servants, whosoever of them knew her, did in her much praise and honor and love thee, for that through the witness of the fruits of a holy conversation, they perceived thy presence in her heart. For she had been the wife of one man, had requited her parents, had governed her house piously, was well reported of for good works, had brought up children, so often travailing in birth of them, as she saw them swerving from thee. Lastly, of all of us thy servants, O Lord, whom on occasion of thine own gift thou sufferest to speak, us, who before her sleeping in thee lived united together, having received the grace of thy baptism, did so take care of, as though she had been mother of us all, so served us, as though she had been a child to us all. Chapter 10. The day now approaching whereon she was to depart this life, which day thou well knewest, we knew not, it came to pass, thyself, as I believe, by thy secret ways so ordering it, that she and I stood alone, leaning on a certain window, which looked into the garden of the house where we now lay at Ostia, were removed from the din of men, we were recruiting from the fatigues of a long journey for the voyage. We were discoursing then together alone very sweetly, and forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things which are before, we were inquiring between ourselves in the presence of thy truth, which thou art, of what sort the eternal life of the saints was to be, which eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, nor hath it entered into the heart of man. But yet we gasped with the mouth of our heart, after those heavenly streams of thy fountain, the fountain of life, which is with thee, that being bedewed thence, according to our captivity, we might in some sort meditate upon so high a mystery. And when our discourse was brought to that point, that very highest delight of the earthly senses, in the very purest material light, was, in respect of the sweetness of that life, not only worthy of comparison, but not even of mention, we raising up ourselves with a more glowing affection towards the self-same, did by degrees pass through all things bodily, even the very heaven, whence sun and moon and stars shine upon the earth. Yea, we were soaring higher yet, by inward musing, and discourse, and admiring of thy works. And we came to our own minds, and went beyond them, that we might arrive at that region of never-failing plenty, where thou feedest Israel for ever with the food of truth, and where life is the wisdom by whom all these things are made, and what have been, and what shall be, and she is not made, but is, as she hath been, and so shall she ever be. Yea rather, to have been, and hereafter to be, are not in her, but only to be, seeing she is eternal. For to have been, and to be hereafter are not eternal. And while we were discoursing and panting after her, we slightly touched on her with the whole effect of our heart, and we sighed, and there we leave bound the first fruits of the Spirit, and returned to vocal expressions of our mouth, where the word spoken has beginning and end. And what is like unto thy word, O Lord, who endureth in himself, without becoming old, and maketh all things new? We were saying then, if to any the tumult of the flesh were hushed, hushed the images of the earth, and waters, and air, hushed also the poles of heaven, yea, the very soul be hushed to herself, and by not thinking on self surmount self, hushed all dreams and imaginary revelations, every tongue and every sign, and whatsoever exists only in transition, since if any could hear, all these say, we made not ourselves, but he made us that abideth for ever. If then, having uttered this, they too should be hushed, having roused only our ears to him who made them, and he alone speak, not by them, but by himself, that we may hear his word, not through any tongue of flesh, nor angel's voice, nor sound of thunder, nor in the dark riddle of a similitude, but might hear whom in these things we love, might hear his very self without these, as we too now strained ourselves, and in swift thought touched on that eternal wisdom which abideth over all. Could this be continued on, and other visions of kind far unlike be withdrawn, and this one ravish and absorb, and wrap up its beholder amid those inward joys, so that life might be for ever that one moment of understanding which now we sighed after, were not this, enter into thy Master's joy? And when shall that be? When we shall all rise again, though we shall not all be changed. Such things was I speaking, and even if not in this very manner and these same words, yet, Lord, Thou knowest, that in that day when we were speaking of these things, and this world with all its delights became, as we spake, contemptible to us, my mother said, Son, for mine own part I have no further delight in anything in this life. What I do here any longer, and to what end I am here, I know not, now that my hopes in this world are accomplished. One thing there was, for which I desired to linger for a while in this life, that I might see Thee a Catholic Christian before I died. My God hath done this for me more abundantly, that I should now see Thee withal, despising earthly happiness, become His servant. What do I here? End of Book 9, Chapter 10.